The mistake we make is thinking that the biggest empires fall because they were defeated in one big battle, but the truth is much more dangerous. They fall because they simply got too big for one person to rule. There is a huge error in how we think about the end of a world power. We assume a power that owns half the world only fails because it loses a war against an outside enemy. In its final years, an empire isn't just a group of fighters. It is the master of the most important trade routes on Earth. It controls the flow of money and goods between distant lands. It is a total system of power, strong, rich, and seemingly impossible to break. Yet, over a short time, this massive machine of control slowly falls apart. It doesn't happen because of a sudden accident or a secret plot. It happens because the very rules that helped them conquer the world became a trap they couldn't escape. If you looked at an empire at its peak, you would see a superpower that wanted for nothing. The government controlled the flow of gold and taxes across the entire map. They had an army that moved with more force and better tools than anyone else, but they always hit a limit where they can no longer expand. When the gold from new lands stops coming in, the bills for the army keep getting bigger. They rely on a single center to hold everything together, but the edges are too far away to watch. The money that built their glory is soon being spent just to stop the pieces from drifting away. The trade routes that brought them wealth become too expensive to guard from rivals. This is the story of how every world power is eventually dismantled by its own success. Before we look at the first crack in the system, tell me in the comments, do you think any government today is too big to stay in one piece? To understand the collapse, you have to understand the rule of central control. The empire believes that only one man at the top can hold all the power. This leader has absolute power over the army and all the money collected from every province. As long as the leader is strong and the army is taking new land, the system stays in one piece. Winning wars brings in new riches and more people to pay taxes to the government. But the empire eventually reaches a point where the cost of the army is higher than the money it brings back. They do not have a clear rule for who should take over when a leader dies. This means that every time a leader is gone, the whole system stops moving while rivals fight for the throne. While the family fights for power, the local people they conquered stop following the rules. The trade routes become unsafe because the soldiers have left to fight for a new king. The system of control is being pulled apart by the very people who were supposed to protect it. The leaders stop caring about the whole empire and start caring only about their own piece of the map. By trying to make sure they always had the strongest leader at the top, they ensured they would eventually have a war every time a leader died. When the empire stops moving outward, it faces a financial crisis that cannot be ignored. The cost of keeping the army on the borders remains high, but the income from war and new land disappears. The leaders in the center find themselves in a trap where they must spend more money than they collect. To solve this, the government often turns to the only thing it fully controls: the money itself. They begin to lower the value of their coins or currency to pay for the rising costs of the state. In modern history, this meant changing the rules of how money was made and distributed, but this decision creates a massive problem for the people who run the economy. Merchants and traders quickly realize the money is worth less than it used to be. They respond by raising the prices of everything from basic materials to military equipment. The government then has to produce even more money to buy the same supplies for the army. This cycle of falling money value and rising prices destroys the trust between the rulers and the people. People stop using the official currency and start hiding physical goods or gold instead. The government then tries to fix the problem by making new rules to force prices to stay low. They might use the army to punish those who do not follow the new economic rules. But force cannot stop the basic laws of trade and supply. Merchants simply stop selling their goods in the open market, and the supply lines go empty. The empire's economy stops being a single unified system and begins to break into small, local pieces. Wealthy landowners retreat to their private estates and stop sending money back to the capital. The center loses its power because it can no longer pay the soldiers who keep the rules in place. The very success of the empire's early growth has created a bill that the current system cannot pay. As the empire loses its ability to pay for control, it enters a stage of split power. The central government becomes too weak to manage its vast territories from one city. To try and survive, the rulers often divide the empire into smaller pieces. They believe that multiple smaller governments will be easier to manage than one giant one. But this division usually backfires by creating new borders and new rivalries. The regions with more trade in gold often stop sharing their wealth with the poorer regions. This means the parts of the empire with the most pressure from foreign armies are left with the least amount of money. The professional army, which was once a single loyal force, begins to fracture. Soldiers stop being loyal to the idea of the empire and start being loyal to the generals who can actually pay them. Generals who control a province or an army begin to act like independent kings. They use their force to collect local taxes and keep the money for themselves. This is the point where the government's rules stop mattering on the edges of the map. Local people realize that the central government can no longer protect them or provide for their needs. They turn to local strongmen or private landowners for safety and order. In exchange for protection, the people give their land and their work to these local lords. This process removes more people and more money from the government's reach. The empire is no longer a solid unit. It is a collection of disconnected zones. Every time the central government tries to use force to bring a province back, it costs more than it is worth. The trade routes that tied the whole system together are now cut by local gates and taxes. Communication slows down because the government can no longer pay for the riders and horses that carry news. The empire has entered a state where the cost of being unified is higher than any of the pieces are willing to pay. In the fourth stage of the collapse, the empire loses its ability to protect the system it created. For centuries, the government kept the trade routes open and the borders safe through constant force. But now, the money to pay for that force has vanished because the cost of control has become too high. The professional army begins to shrink because the state cannot buy enough iron, equipment, or supplies to keep it running. To fill the gap, the government stops hiring its own citizens and starts hiring foreign fighters. These are soldiers from outside the empire who fight only for a paycheck, not for loyalty to the government's rules. This decision creates a dangerous new situation where the people holding the weapons have no reason to protect the state if the money stops. When the government fails to pay these foreign troops on time, the soldiers turn their weapons against the very cities they were hired to guard. They realize that the empire is now a hollow shell with a lot of physical wealth but no power to defend it. At the same time, the neighbors of the empire see that the borders are weak and the army is divided. They begin to launch raids to take back territory or steal the wealth that the empire had collected for generations. The government tries to stop these attacks by offering the invaders gold or land to go away. This is a disastrous policy because it shows the world that the empire is too weak to fight and would rather pay for peace. Every payment to an enemy makes the empire poorer and the enemy stronger. The government is now in a position where it is literally funding its own destruction. Inside the cities, the loss of security means that trade stops completely. No merchant will risk moving goods through a territory where the government cannot stop bandits or rebel soldiers. Without trade, the cities cannot get enough resources to stay alive, and the population begins to flee to the countryside. The great roads and buildings that were once the pride of the empire begin to fall apart because there is no tax money left for maintenance. The state has lost its monopoly on force, and in the world of power, a government that cannot defend its rules is no longer a government. The final stage of collapse occurs when the central government loses its last piece of authority. The people at the top no longer have the money to pay for the rules or the army. The trade routes that once connected different parts of the world are now completely broken. The empire does not usually end with one final explosion, but with a quiet realization that the central rules no longer exist. Local leaders stop asking the capital for permission and start making their own laws and their own currency. The physical symbols of power, like the grand government buildings and the stone roads, are left to decay because there is no one left to pay for repairs. Wealthy landowners become the new rulers of small, isolated territories. The people who once see themselves as part of a global superpower now only care about the safety of their own village. This change is the outcome of a system that tried to maintain its massive size while its money was shrinking. The empire spent all its wealth on the army and the debt until there was nothing left for the people. The result is a total loss of the unity that once made the state strong. The fall of the system is the natural consequence of ignoring the gap between what a government spends and what it actually has. Every empire that has ever existed followed this same progression, from growth to debt, and finally to fracture. It is a simple rule of power. Once the cost of control is higher than the profit of trade, the empire will cease to exist. The pieces of the old system eventually form the foundations of new, smaller states that will start the cycle over again.